Welcome to the HiRSE Seminar Series on Research Software Engineering in Helmholtz and beyond.
Okay, I hope this works. Thanks for the introduction, Claire. Indeed, I mean, we weren't quite able to figure out when exactly we met the first time, but doesn't matter also for this. And also, thanks for the invitation to talk in the seminar, because indeed, like research software software engineering have all been on my agenda and plate since you mentioned, actually, since I started university. Because I couldn't quite decide for only going for computer science, so I chose applied computer science, which had to deal with bioinformatics as well as my minor and these kind of things. And I was quite happy when this research software engineering became established as a term, because finally what I was doing, all the kind of things, had a home. And I think a bit unusual maybe in the RSE community is that I'm coming really from the software engineering side, because many RSEs or many people in the RSE community tend to come more from the application side. And so naturally now I'm also a professor of computer science, a professor of software engineering. We do research, and we do research about software and software research and things. And what I noticed that, I mean, there are a few more people in the world doing this. I'm not the only one, but we're still a small but continuously growing group. But what we see that people kind of confuse these terms a bit. So this was the inspiration for calling this talk like research software research and more. Same goes for research software engineering research are two quite different things, but people tend to confuse them. And maybe I can shed a bit of light on all these things, that these terms, this various combination of these words are actually different things. I will not talk about every single of these combinations, but hopefully we'll have a better picture of what's going on in RSE and research at the moment. I have a couple of slides introducing RSE again from my perspective. I guess most people of you are familiar with that by now, but let's maybe still repeat to be on the same page, and then we talk a bit more about especially research in the field of RSE and on software, on research software. So first slide, and I think many of you have seen these numbers, just really backing the statement that we all frequently make, that research really needs software. The most valuable data is really not useful without software anymore, so researchers need software. And 2017, it was already that Alice Brett and a group of people published this State of the Nation report about research software engineers. It was basically based on a survey on the British Russell universities, I think, where they found that really 92% of researchers stated that they use software in their research. And that doesn't just mean email communication with fellow collaborators or so, but really as a part of the research process. 67% back then already said it's fundamental for their research, so they couldn't actually do their research without it. There's somehow a bit of a philosophical question if this is really not possible without it, but for contemporary research couldn't probably happen without really software support. And then another 56% say also they develop their own research software. So they would at minimum write their own scripts for the data processing, but maybe even more complex things that they need for their research. And we are mostly interested in the second two, right? The says 67 and the 56% say this is really crucial, and we will also develop our own research software. I mean, I would guess that if you would repeat the same survey now, that the numbers would be even higher, because I couldn't, even with the most theoretical subjects, it's nowadays really difficult to imagine researchers that do not use any kind of software. So 92% even seems to be too low for that. But that maybe depends also on the definition of what you see as software and software support. Interestingly, although we have been talking about research software for 10 years or so, research software engineering, a community agreed definition of what research software actually is and what it's not has only been published two years ago, 2021. Also was a result of a quite nice international discussion during the pandemic. And the essence of this definition is that we refer research software is software in all possible forms, essentially, that was created during the research process or for a research purpose. People, for example, often ask if Excel then would be a research software. Well, we said, no, you can use it for research, but it wasn't created for research or for a specific research purpose, so it's not research software. On the other hand, when you have an Excel sheet that has some visuals, basic application macros in there that could qualify then as research software if you use it for data processing. So it's not always that clear cut, but the specific purpose for research and there is really like essential to that definition. And then around that, it has just received really more attention than past years. And you see that I just posted here pasted here in the left some screenshots from a workshop series that has been running in conjunction with different major international conferences for a couple of years, really focusing on software engineering challenges in science. There's this position paper where several of the people present here have been involved, resulting from the 2019 German HiRSE conference. Also, Willy's paper here looking at just like what makes software engineering for computational science specific. What do we need to do there? Also, Carol Goebel's paper from 2014 saying the state making this climate better software, better research, right? Which has really pinpoints the message of this. So high quality research probably cannot be done really without software. So we need better software that we can also do better research. And if we look at what research software engineering actually is, many people ask, isn't this just normal software engineering? So is this actually a special thing? Because software engineering has produced so many techniques already, why can you not use them? Yeah, we can. I mean, research software engineering really shares a lot of commonalities with what I call here now mainstream software engineering, like textbook industrial software engineering. But there are also some specific challenges that are not yet well addressed in general. And this mostly comes from two things. So one is the nature of scientific research. So experiments change, things is experimental. People want to adjust software to their experimental settings. Research software often is not finished because for the next experiment you want to change something, and this explorative nature of scientific experiments makes it challenging to develop research software. Often it's also not so clear in the beginning of a project what the software actually needs to do, so this develops in a much more dynamic way than it tends to do for industrial projects, where there maybe is a vision for a product from the beginning of a project. So this is like nature of scientific research, but also the cultural environment where research software development happens plays a big role. We have often international, but also very dynamic teams with a high turnover of staff because PhD students move, postdocs move. There's a lot of financing through projects, which is by definition for a period of years. And all this makes it also very challenging to develop software. And we need just a different approach to do that well than we would have an industry where there's much more continuous funding typically. And for all these reasons, this problem receives more attention. As Claire was also saying, there's this international research software engineering community that really took this better software research slogan, coined the term research software engineering, and that was only some 10 years ago, interestingly. And I find this interesting because research software is probably the kind of software that we have the longest from the beginning of the computers. But nevertheless, the really specific attention that it receives, this is a quite recent thing. And if you would look for a definition of what is HiRSE actually, it's a mix of computer science for sure, programming and software engineering in the first place, but not only. But it also has a lot of components from all the application disciplines that work with. So all these computational science disciplines also bring in their needs, their requirements, their habits, traditions, their cultures, and their specific technical needs. So that comes in as well. And what you also see a lot of in HiRSE is just like open science practices. So somehow this community has more or less from the outset agreed that many of these open sciences practices are a good thing, are open source, sharing of code, open publications, sharing, being very collaborative, this kind of thing. So that's also something that comes in here and also influences, of course, how software projects are managed and shared. We have, Claire mentioned that already, also like a diverse, very international community that especially grew a lot through or during the pandemic. And now it's carrying back a bit into the national communities, it's our feeling, but that's certainly received a boost during that time. Yeah, and we're organized, as Claire also mentioned, in national networks, international council as an umbrella organization. I will do a bit more advertisement for all these groups you can join later in the talk. So yeah, a while ago, I just sat down, okay, what actually do we have in HiRSE? So it's like a growing community with very many interests, very many diverse people coming together. But what are actually the things that the HiRSE community members work with? Yeah, and maybe at the core, there's somehow the community itself, like thanks to people like Claire, who are like as community managers really proactively working on building a vibrant community. That is certainly something that is not just there, but it receives their own attention, like how to manage that, how to create chapters, how to create groups, how to boost that. I mean, this seminar series itself is actually part of that, right? Creating a strong community. So a lot of things are happening there. But also other themes on the radar. I think apart from the community, in the past I identified these other six. So maybe there's more we can discuss. But I think this thing's capture quite well what we have in the HiRSE community. So one thing is certainly one area is certainly HiRSE practice. Many HiRSEs research, so software developing researchers in daily life or day-to-day research software development are concerned with this, and they're very happy to have a forum for exchanging best practices and tools for how to develop their research software that they do for their research projects. A bit connected with that is certainly like HiRSE training. So researchers without a software engineering background are interested to somehow acquire software engineering, so SE skills, whether this is through own training, online tutorials, really workshops, you know what. And on the other hand, there's also software developers who seek to acquire certain research skills to be able to do research software engineering, because this is also sometimes something we saw. Being a software engineer or software developer doesn't mean that you can automatically do research software engineering. That's a specific skill set that's also required for this. On the one hand side, to do with the application domain that you're dealing with, but also many of the other things, this open, for example, managing open repositories doesn't come naturally to a computer science. This is not something that is necessarily on the standard curriculum. So this is also things that people need to learn. We have HiRSE infrastructure, meaning all the kind of support we would have for developing, executing, and maintaining research software. So there's on the one hand technical infrastructure, like Jülich running all these high performance clusters, for example, but also the technical infrastructure that universities would give to their researchers. But with infrastructure, we also mean here maybe some financial support that is given through projects or sort of continuous funding, support departments at universities, and everything else that can help the development and maintenance of research software. Again, connected with that is maybe a bit like HiRSE careers. So when you ask okay, who's doing that? What's the roles? Probably the typical HiRSE, I don't think we have numbers on this, but very often you mean the practitioners in HiRSE are often the postdoc is actually paid for doing something else and developing a lot of research software as part of their postdoc contract. And it really depends on the discipline, whether they are acknowledged for this or not, and how their job perspectives also are. But the HiRSE careers movement, say, it's really trying to establish a clear career path that is labeled HiRSE and not being an HiRSE but being labeled as a postdoc, or being an HiRSE but being labeled as whatever it is that is not really an HiRSE role. And with that, it's the labeling, but also what is a professional profile? What is a career path? What are the qualifications that someone would need for calling themselves an HiRSE? So that's the HiRSE careers theme. And connected with that, HiRSE advocacy, it's how do we get institutional support for that? We can define our ideal picture of an HiRSE career, of course, but who's going to pay them for this? What will they get? Is there a chance for a permanent position? Are they funded on projects? And generally also, how is HiRSE work being recognized? How are they evaluated? This is also in terms of papers or lines of code. Would to give an extreme example, that would not be a candidate. But also, if we say we have another career profile, how do we decide if it's a good RSE that we want to promote? That also falls under this area. And then finally, and that is the thing I want to focus most on in this talk, is this idea of RSE research. It's a bit of a meta perspective at RSE because, okay, we're treating ourselves now as a research subject, and we try to bit of like analyze and better understand and improve the whole process of developing research software. Yeah, and this is a bit more the focus for the rest of the talk. We could classify, I think, RSE research in two broad domains or two big parts. So on the one hand side, we have research that is focused on understanding better what is going on in scientific research development. On the other hand, we have research that has maybe more an engineering type of approach that tries to improve RSE research or research software development. And for example, in Understand, we could ask questions like, okay, how do researchers actually develop software? Like, how do they do that? How do they proceed to come to a concrete software project? Which programming languages? What methods, tools do they use? So what are the things they are working with? And what are their specific problems when developing software, both in a technical sense, but also in the more soft sense, like, yeah, they could do this technically, but they don't have the time because they're not being paid for it, for example. So these are questions like understanding better what is actually going on, and also understanding better where the problems actually are. And yeah, based on that, it's a bit the mission of RSE research to improve things as well. This also was academic software engineering research is doing. For example, looking at what is actually the best way maybe to organize research software development processes, and not only from a technical point of view, but also in the specific context of where research software development happens. What can we give researchers as guidelines how this works in the best way, taking into account also the resources that they have or have not available for this. More technically speaking, what additional tools do they maybe need for research software development? Maybe there's a big overlap, and many of the existing tools can just be reused in scientific software development like they can in industry. But maybe there's also gaps where new things are needed. Personally, I think that in terms of quality assurance and testing research software, I think there's still some gap to close, because the current testing frameworks normally are not really tailored to research software, and specific things are difficult to test with the current testing frameworks that we have. So probably there's still room for improving that, or just like having tools that are a bit more tailored to that, supporting research scientists. And that's connected to the next question here. It's not so clear sometimes how we measure the scientific quality and scientific correctness of software. So we do usually have good approaches for measuring quality. There's all kinds of quality dimensions that we can quantify, and we also have good approaches of ensuring correctness of software in general, but then especially capturing the scientific correctness and scientific quality is not so trivial. Often I would even argue we do not even have a good understanding what we mean by that. And so at that point, it's just difficult to measure it automatically and provide tools for it. So these are all questions that we somehow need to solve before we can provide better tools. But I think there's a lot of open problems that we need to work on. By the way, some of this is also described in a paper that is available as a preprint. So first author, because it's alphabetically, is Michael Felderer, but also Willi here in the talk was one of the main organizers of that preprint. So if you're interested in reading a bit more on this idea of RSE research in general, here's also like a nice link and URL for you. But I will talk about a few more examples in this talk. For mostly examples now of RSE research work that I was involved in, but not exclusively. Just to give you an idea of what we have. And I have some examples on Understand, and then a bit of a longer example on the improve point, to give you a flavor of that. So one project to understand a bit more about what happens in research software development is this year. This originated when I was still in the Netherlands. I think we started it just before the pandemic with the help of two student assistants initially, and then it turned into Kevin Quach's master thesis, which he, by the way, presented also last year earlier this year at the German HiRSE conference. We found a great acronym called SWORDS. Doesn't match the long version actually exactly anymore because we never analyzed research data. We only focused on software, but we kept the acronym anyway. And the basic idea was, or the starting point for this was, that the University of Utrecht had a quite good central support department, not only for data management, but also for research software management, also employing a handful of research software engineers that were there for helping all the research at the universities with their software project. And they were also running together with the libraries all sorts of trainings, like workshops on sustainable computing, R cafes for helping the member of the university with their R programming projects, and so on and so forth. But they're a bit stuck at a point and say, okay, what do our people actually need? What should we provide them with? What do they actually do? Do they write more Python or more R, or what should we focus on? What about other languages like Julia? Is this a thing already? So what should we do? And one approach would have been, of course, like to send a survey to people and ask them, but that's one approach. And that was also tried, but a complementary thing that we want to try is, okay, let's just look at what people are doing. And luckily, so Utrecht University has a lot of like open science proponents already, and quite a lot of people put their research software projects on GitHub, and they also link their GitHub profiles from their university profile page. And we thought, okay, we can collect this and let's just automatically look into these repositories, what we find there, to understand a bit better what's happening in there. And the details are all in Kevin's thesis. In a nutshell, the process was something like this. So we, in phase one of this whole SWORDS pipeline, we collect users. So that means, in that sense, GitHub users affiliated with Utrecht University. So again, this is quite an intricate process in itself because there were different sources of knowledge, how to guess which are actually users. In the first round, we identified some 600 something. Then we added a bit of GitHub data for being able to classify them better. And after filtering, we had some 180 left. For these users in phase two, we would then retrieve all of their repositories. So Utrecht University employees, we get all their repositories, and then we would filter them further because a lot of repositories are then not research software, but websites, student projects, all kinds of other things that we are not interested in. After this manual labeling, 820 somethings were left, and then we would collect the actual variables to run the actual data analysis. Here's like the how fair is variables. I will show you in a minute what that is. Other GitHub data that we could just fetch, and variables, again, connected with software fairness. And once we had that, we had a nice data set to play with. So then we have all the data pre-processing and visualization of results. And just to show you a few glimpses of what we saw on there, it was something like this. So top 10 programming languages used in the University of Utrecht. And you see here, it's also split across departments or faculties, because we wanted to see a bit if there's a broad difference between the disciplines. And we saw something, for example, that Python actually across all university, but all faculties but one is really like the dominant programming language by now, at least for the publicly available GitHub repositories that we looked at, followed by R. Many people were suspecting before that R would be the really top used programming language, but this is only true in the social sciences still, because our suspicion is that Utrecht has a particularly strong R community in the psychology department, so it comes from there, and they have a lot of like open source repositories. Otherwise, you see the general picture, so we have a lot of Python. Jupyter notebooks are a bit tricky, but because they can contain Python or R or a mix of different things, but mostly this also boils down to Python code, but we cannot easily automatically look inside. Yeah, and then we have a number of other languages that are also used across departments. But Python and R are certainly the most prominent one. And of course, this is a very simple analysis, but it already kind of confirms the thing that providing support for Python and R is a reasonable thing to do for the support department. Whereas like Haskell only concerns a few people in the computer science department. So there's no resource would not be well spent when the central support department would provide a lot of like infrastructure for that. Another of the results we looked at, okay, what are they doing in terms of licenses? Again, the same distributions here, the faculties. Interestingly, and that is, I don't know if it's really a concern, but at least an observation that is something where we need to do something about, is that many of the open source software repositories didn't give any license. Geosciences were really more than half, 60%. Social science is quite much better, but still like, almost 75% did not give any license information on the project, which just makes it difficult to reuse the projects, or it definitely makes it legally impossible to use those research software projects, which is a shame, especially when people already have made the move towards putting their code in an open repository. So and then it would be nice if it's also legally possible for others to reuse their things. And in our experience discussing with people is mostly like a matter of knowledge and education, because some have never heard about the importance of a license. Some have, but they have so little knowledge about licenses and hear so many, I don't know, stereotypes, rumors, warnings, that this is something so mysterious to them that they better not touch it, and then they don't give any license instead of talking someone to them. So this is, maybe you recognize this with your institutions as well, but what we saw from the people here that put licenses, many of them were quite open. MIT with a very permissive one, and again the GPL. That's kind of the other group that it goes more for the GPL field. But in our experience, that was again often the R community, because just R has a lot of GPL license packages as well, and so they go with what the community kind of shows them. Well, one more. We collected all sorts of what we called here is like research software for fair variables. These are just like binary things that you could check on the repositories. For example, if the repository is open, this is quite trivial in the case, of course, when we look on open GitHub repositories. I'm not quite sure why the geoscience is here 99. So perhaps they added in a separate repository that is not open, but this should actually also be 100. It has license again, but also, for example, whether it has a citation format file in this, like if the software citation is enabled and visible, if they have used the quality checklist, which is fairly low here, if they have actually used the version control correctly. It's mostly the case. But some repositories, they would only dump one final version of the software to GitHub, for example, and not have a history of commits from the start, which would mean correct usage. If the repository is active, so if there have been recent comments and so on and so forth. And without going into the details of these here, I would say still social sciences here, the runners up. But these things give you just a bit of picture of what your researchers are doing in terms of software development. I think in future iterations of Source, we plan to take this much further, be more detailed. But for the moment, this is really what we can reasonably do, and which already provides us a lot of information of just what's going on. We are now that I moved to University of Potsdam last year, we have started to also now a project to run the same pipeline on our own repositories in Potsdam. And it turns out to be not as easy as expected, because the actual analysis pipeline is not so much the problem, but you need to identify the repositories first. And this is very organization specific. And unfortunately, in Potsdam, we do not have so much information up front as we have in Utrecht. So this is a bit more a cumbersome project, cumbersome process. And it would be great, of course, to see other people applying this pipeline to their organizations as well, so that we could compare. Source itself, so I call it a source template here, and that's exactly the case actually for the initial repository. So it's set up as a template that is like, adaptable to other organizations. The tricky part, as I said, is the identification of the Git repositories, but then once you have that, the rest of the pipeline kind of runs as it is. So it would be cool to see this being applied to some other organizations as well. I do think, and this is also what we try and put for some small instance of this, that this can make quite nice student projects as well. So maybe that's a starting point for many as well. So if you do, please let me know, and then we can also discuss and compare results, hopefully. So this idea is one example. Yeah, we can look at repositories and see what we can find there. Another thing, and this is not so much empirical, but maybe more thinking about what we have, but this is also like a really academic exercise, is something like this, right? You might have seen this. So the DLR has some research software classification into 4 different application classes. And that is super helpful, not only in practice, but actually also for academic discussions, like we found. And the DLR has developed this from a very practical perspective for giving their own research software developers guidelines of how much quality assurance to do for their current research software project. So meaning if something is application class 1, it means it's a fairly small project for example, from a bachelor or master or PhD thesis project. But it's not so small that it would only be used by that particular person, but it's probably the code gets published with a thesis so that other researchers can reuse it. So that's barely the scope. And then the guidelines say something like, it should have basic quality assurance, for example. It should have a license so that people can use it, and so on and so forth. And if you get higher, application class 3, it says here mission critical software. Could be medical products, software that is sold to a customer that might have like warranties. But you could also imagine things like the software for the next space mission kind of thing. You want to be sure that that is running correctly and performing and without bugs before you send it on a space mission. And there are a whole different set of quality assurance techniques apply, you can imagine. And DLR has come up with this classification of software, and I find this very helpful, not only in practice, but also in academic discussions. And similar, and I wanted to point you to this because this is still a discussion that you can join. Talking about this in the context of this Towards Research Software paper, we also talked about a bit like okay, what categories of research software do we actually have? So this is not the same as classes, because classes was a bit from non-critical to very critical and what kind of quality assurance to apply. But this is more about the kinds of, what are they responsible for? And a very initial categorization foresees now these 4 categories. So we say on the one hand side, we can have research software that is for modeling, simulation, data analytics. Then we can have another kind of research software would be control software that's running for lab equipment, running experiments and instruments. So it's not so much for data processing, but maybe more for data collection in the first place. But we could also have in engineering research, like in software engineering, we often develop software as a prototype for something. This is also a type of research software. And then we have the whole part of research or kind of research software that is more infrastructure and platform for running other things. We're not yet sure if this is the final categorization or if this will be complete, how much further we need to differentiate. If you're interested in this, there's a pointer here. So November is coming up. A working group is meeting in Braunschweig for 2 days to discuss this question further. If you think this is something I want to engage in, I have ideas about that, feel free to visit that website and sign up to the event. So one third thing I wanted to talk a bit about was this not only understanding and thinking about software, but what can we actually do to improve software construction? And I'm going to talk about something more about workflows. People have different definitions about workflows, but from a very abstract perspective, I would describe it as something like it's depicted here. So we have different modules We have some input that flows into the first module, then it flows through a series of modules, and at the end there is an output. And just this really modular architecture of a software where something flows in and flows out at the end, this is what we could call a workflow from a very broad perspective. Very simplified, this is a bit like a Lego box for developing research software products, right? We have pre-built component, we just like orchestrate and put them together to achieve our data analysis pipeline. And this is what we call a workflow. For this definition, it also doesn't matter if it's implemented in Python or as a shell script or with a dedicated workflow engine. It's more a question of where it needs to run, but the general definitions of workflow would be something like that. And as I said, so this modular structure itself already simplifies a lot of the construction, because instead of writing everything from scratch, I can assemble my software from pre-built components. But then there's other questions. For example, if I have now this goal of building a workflow, one of the questions is, okay, how do I actually find a suitable workflow for a data analysis problem? And yeah, in the past years, 15 years meanwhile, actually, I've worked on things to kind of semi-automate this process of building a workflows from existing components. I guess like 10 years ago, I would have described it as a search engine for workflows, using a search engine analogy. 5 years ago, I would just have described it as a route planning for data analysis processes, using like a Google Maps analogy. Nowadays, I would probably describe it as a ChatGPT for constructing workflows, meaning where you say, I give the AI a search term like, I have this kind of input, I want this kind of output, can you please suggest a suitable workflow for me? And then it would do that. And we kind of have that. I don't want to go into the details of this. So this has been a process over the past years very much. APE, so the Automated Pipeline Explorer, is the latest edition of a library that we built for facilitating this kind of workflow construction. So if you are interested in that, talk to me or check that out. But I want to talk about some connected problem with this. So imagine this as a ChatGPT, but it doesn't just come with one possible workflow, but it says, okay, here's like 10, 20, 100 possibilities for solving this problem. And why does this come? Usually we do have different tools that we can combine in different ways that all lead to the same kind of output. And then we just don't know what the best one is. For example, here I don't know if someone's familiar here with the bio.tools platform as a registry from bioinformatics. As of last week, it had almost 30,000 tools registered in there. And of course, not all of them combine in all possible ways. But if you search for a workflow for protein identification or whatever, then you tend to get a lot of possibilities because there are just like so many possible tools to combine. And then the question becomes not only how can you suggest me a possible workflows, but among all these possibilities that you suggest, what is the best one? And this is a problem that is not unique to this automated workflow construction that we're building. We only see this in a very prominent way because we get these lists of very many workflows. But the same thing actually happens when people just build their software from scratch, because they also don't know what all the possibilities are, or they usually do not systematically explore all the possibilities before deciding for one solution. And this has also been shown in different studies. I posted in 2 articles by here. Basically, what happened in these studies was that they gave one and the same data set to a number of teams, 60, 70 different teams in these studies, with the same kind of question to analyze. And all these teams came up with different analysis pipelines. They were using different tools, and they were also obtaining different results. But now the question is, okay, who was right? And this is not so easy to answer. Usually what you would need to do in practice is to run different pipelines to compare the results, to see if there's consensus. Maybe you can benchmark them to find which one is actually producing the best results. There are in principle, many possible ways, but they are time-consuming and tedious to execute. So what we did is say, okay, if something is tedious and difficult to execute and people therefore don't do it, then a software engineering answer to this is often, let's try to build a system that kind of can partially automate this process. And this is an ongoing project that started last year. So something I won when I was still in the Netherlands. So financed by the Netherlands eScience Center, with this long title, Facilitating the Great Bake-Off of Bioinformatics Workflows. And central to this is really the bake-off idea. So Claire will know this, like Great British Bake Off, basically baking competition. And the central idea is there to identify the best bakers. We first cast candidates, then we let them perform regularly bake cakes, and based on the result, we determine who the winner is. And the idea of this project is to build a platform that facilitates this for workflows. In that setting, bioinformatics workflows, saying, okay, in a first phase, this platform will support the generation of candidate workflows. And in the second phase, we will run them on actual data, like benchmarking data, where we have some known ground truth, and then compare their performance. And by this, we mean especially scientific performance, not so much the runtime, what computer scientists would be interested in, but more like parameters that come from the science itself. So that's a workflow idea. This is embedded in a whole lot of like other infrastructure and building on a lot of like systems and libraries like this, connecting to the life sciences ecosystem that we have. But this is ongoing. We have almost finished 1 year of 3, so I cannot show very many results yet. What I wanted to plant at this idea. We also have a shorter title now. We're calling ourselves Workflomics. Workflomics.org also gives you a bit of more information. I want to say, if someone is interested in these kind of thinking about workflows, about what's the best possible computational experiment for a case, please feel free to get in touch, and we're happy for more collaborators and testers also for this platform. But I wanted to present this today as just an approach of what can we actually improve in workflow construction. And this is a bit of an overarching thinking about the quality of scientific experiments. Right, short summary. The things I want you to remember from today is, one, of course, you agree, research needs software, but also research software needs research to understand better what's happening, and based on that, then improve how we are developing research software. There is also an emerging HiRSE research community now in Germany, especially facilitated together in conjunction with the Gesellschaft für Informatik and DRSE. The situation we have here, it's called Fachgruppe. I don't know how to translate this into English very well, but if you're interested in HiRSE, and especially also taking a research look at this meta perspective on research software engineering, then this is maybe also one of the places you should go to. Join our mailing list, join us at the next meeting. The next one is coming up in October already, and just engage in these discussions. I have a whole list of links where you can also trace further what this has, and also large links of few papers and reference collections about the things I talked to today. Perhaps we can share slides afterwards. You have a recording and you can see this again. But maybe for the moment, I go back to this one, because this is the most important thing you should do. And then I'm done with talking, and hope that we have some time and also some questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you for watching our seminar. Please check out the slides on Zenodo linked below, and see you next time.